Caroline doesn't need that cabin, her mother said, before the lawyer had even finished reading the will. The words settled over the polished oak conference table like dust no one wanted to disturb, and for a moment, no one spoke. Caroline Whitmore sat very still in the leather chair across from her mother, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she were attending a Sunday service instead of her grandfather's while reading. The office overlooked Main Street in their small Ohio town, where pickup trucks rolled past brick storefronts and the courthouse clock marked 10 o'clock sharp. Her grandfather, Henry Whitmore, had been gone for exactly 3 weeks, and the grief still felt new, like a coat she hadn't quite broken in. The lawyer, Mr. Davenport, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He was in his late 60s, gray hair combed back, voice steady from decades of delivering news that changed families. As stated in the final revision dated March 14th, he continued, the property located on Lake Everett, including the 2-bedroom cabin and surrounding 3 acres, is to be transferred in full ownership to Caroline Whitmore. Caroline had not expected it. She had driven to the appointment believing she would hear about modest savings, perhaps a few heirlooms, maybe the old fishing rods that had lined her grandfather's garage. The cabin had always felt like something larger than property. It sat 90 minutes north of town, tucked between pine trees and clear water, its wooden porch facing west so the sunset spilled across the lake in streaks of gold and orange. She had spent summers there as a child, learning how to cast a line and how to sit quietly enough to hear the wind move through the branches. Her mother, Linda Whitmore, shifted in her seat, the sound of her bracelet tapping against the table sharp in the silence. At 88, Linda still carried herself with a rigid posture, chin slightly raised, as though the world might challenge her authority at any moment. That cabin requires upkeep, Linda said, her voice calm but edged with dismissal. Property taxes alone are over $4,000 a year. Caroline lives in a condo. She doesn't need extra burdens. Caroline felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the old pattern of being spoken about as though she were not in the room. She was 67 years old, a retired elementary school librarian who had balanced budgets, paid mortgages, and managed her own life for decades. Yet, in her mother's presence, she often felt reduced to the quiet daughter who needed guidance. Mr. Davenport glanced between them. The will is quite specific, he said. Your father made no conditions regarding Caroline's financial situation. Linda gave a thin smile. My father was sentimental. He knew Caroline liked that place as a child. That doesn't mean it makes sense now. Caroline looked down at the copy of the document placed before her. Her name appeared in black ink, clear and unmistakable. She traced the letters with her eyes, not touching the page, as if afraid the print might smudge. She remembered the last afternoon she had spent with her grandfather at the cabin. They had sat on the dock, their feet dangling above the water, measuring the length of a base he had caught with a metal tape measure that still hung by the back door. One day, he had said, staring out across the lake, I hope you'll have a place that feels like yours. Not borrowed. Not temporary. Yours. At the time, she had smiled and thought he was talking about confidence, not real estate. Back in the office, Linda leaned forward. Surely there's a way to reconsider, she said to the lawyer. As his only child, I should have a say in how the property is handled. We could sell it. Split the proceeds in a practical manner. Practical. The word landed harder than it should have. Caroline finally lifted her gaze. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she asked quietly, was this the final version he signed? Mr. Davenport nodded. Yes. Witnessed and notarized. A pause stretched between the three of them, thick but not chaotic. Outside, the courthouse clock chimed the quarter hour. Caroline felt something shift inside her, not anger, not even defiance, but clarity. Her grandfather had made a choice. He had put it in writing. And for the first time that morning, she understood that the discussion in that room was not about square footage or tax bills. It was about who decided what she deserved. She straightened in her chair, the leather creaking softly beneath her, and folded the will closed with careful hands. She had come expecting to mourn. She had not expected to defend her place. In her own family. But as her mother began listing reasons why the cabin would only complicate things, Caroline realized that this was no longer just about a lakeside house. It was about whether her grandfather's final wish would be honored or quietly erased before it ever reached her hands. Caroline did not speak again in the lawyer's office after she closed the will, but the silence she carried home with her felt heavier than any argument could have been. The drive back to her condominium took just under 20 minutes, along streets she had known for decades, past the grocery store where she shopped every Tuesday and the public library where she had worked for nearly 30 years. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt settled. She parked in her assigned space, turned off the engine, and sat with her hands resting on the steering wheel, watching a thin layer of clouds move across the late afternoon sky. She had spent most of her adult life making herself smaller to keep the peace, agreeing when it was easier than explaining, stepping aside when her mother's voice grew firm and unwavering. Even after retiring at 65, even after paying off her own mortgage and managing her own investments, she had still driven her mother to appointments, sorted her paperwork, and listened to long monologues about what was sensible and what was not. Practical decisions had always belonged to Linda. Emotional attachments had always been labeled indulgent. Inside her condominium, Caroline placed her purse on the kitchen counter and removed the copy of the will from its folder. She smoothed the pages flat against the granite surface as if they were delicate photographs. The language was clear, direct, almost spare. Henry Whitmore had signed his name with steady handwriting. No conditions. No contingencies. No shared ownership. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the window overlooking the parking lot, remembering how the cabin had never felt complicated when she was young. It had been simple with siding painted a soft green, 2 small bedrooms with quilts folded at the foot of each bed, and a living room that smelled faintly of pine and old books. The dock had been rebuilt 5 years earlier, sturdy enough to hold 2 lawn chairs and a cooler filled with ice. Her grandfather had taken pride in keeping the place maintained without ever turning it into something flashy or modern. He measured repairs in inches and seasons, not in market value. As evening settled in, her phone rang. The caller identification displayed her mother's name. Caroline let it ring twice before answering. Linda's voice carried the same composed certainty it had in the office. She spoke about responsibility, about how owning lake property required time and money, about how selling it could create a college fund for Caroline's grandchildren, even though Caroline did not have any children. The details blurred together into one steady current of persuasion. Caroline listened without interrupting. She moved to the dining table and sat down, the will still open before her. When her mother paused, expecting agreement, Caroline said only that she needed time to consider everything. The response was met with a sigh that suggested disappointment rather than understanding. After the call ended, the condominium felt unusually quiet. The refrigerator hummed softly. A car door slammed outside. Caroline ran her fingers along the edge of the paper once more. It occurred to her that her grandfather had revised his will just months before his passing, long after he had begun using a cane and limiting his trips into town. That meant he had been deliberate. He had driven to the law office or arranged for someone to bring the documents to him. He had signed with witnesses present. None of that aligned with the idea of a sentimental impulse. She folded the document carefully and placed it back in its envelope. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to imagine standing on the cabin porch not as a visitor, but as the owner. The thought did not feel burdensome. It felt steady. And as she turned off the kitchen lights and prepared for bed, she understood that what lay ahead would not be a simple family disagreement. It would be a test of whether she would continue to accept decisions made on her behalf or finally insist on honoring the one that had been written in her name. The next morning, Caroline woke before sunrise, her mind already turning over details she had not allowed herself to fully examine the night before. She brewed coffee and sat at her small kitchen table, the envelope containing the will placed neatly beside her mug. The quiet of early morning had always been her clearest thinking time, long before she retired from the library and long before her days began revolving around errands and appointments for her mother. She opened her laptop and searched the county property records for the cabin on Lake Everett. The page loaded slowly, displaying parcel numbers, assessed values, and recent tax payments. Everything appeared current. Property taxes had been paid in full through the end of the year. That detail caught her attention. Her grandfather had handled his own finances meticulously, but during his final months, he had relied more heavily on assistance. Caroline had assumed her mother helped with those payments. Yet the record showed a transfer request initiated just days after his passing. The filing status read pending review. Caroline leaned back in her chair and read the line again. A transfer request suggested that someone had already attempted to change the ownership record. She checked the date carefully. It was 2 days before the will reading. The timing did not align with coincidence. She picked up her phone and called the county clerk's office. After a brief hold, a polite voice explained that a preliminary inquiry had been submitted regarding a possible sale of the property, but no finalized deed had been recorded. The clerk mentioned that the inquiry had been withdrawn the morning of the will reading. Caroline thanked her and ended the call slowly. She stared at the screen, feeling that quiet clarity deepen. Her mother had spoken about practicality in the lawyer's office, about sentiment clouding judgment, yet someone had taken steps to explore selling the cabin before the will was even read aloud. Caroline closed her laptop and drove to her mother's house later that afternoon. The brick ranch sat on a corner lot with trimmed hedges and a flag mounted near the front door. Linda answered promptly, as though she had been expecting her. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and furniture polish. They sat across from one another on matching armchairs. Caroline did not accuse. She simply mentioned that she had reviewed the county records and noticed a recent inquiry regarding the cabin. Linda's expression shifted only slightly, a brief tightening around the eyes. She explained that she had asked a local real estate agent for an informal estimate, nothing more. She said it was responsible to understand market value, especially when property might become a financial burden. Her tone remained calm, almost instructional. Caroline listened, hands folded in her lap as they had been in the lawyer's office. She thought about the withdrawn filing, about the timing, about the assumption that she would accept whatever decision was presented as reasonable. After a moment, she said quietly that she intended to visit the cabin that weekend to assess its condition herself. Linda's posture stiffened. She reminded Caroline that the roads near the lake were narrow and that maintenance would require time and resources. The caution felt less like concern and more like resistance. Caroline stood to leave, smoothing the front of her sweater. She thanked her mother for the information and walked to the door without raising her voice. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn. As she stepped into her car, she understood that the issue was no longer theoretical. Paperwork had already been set in motion. Decisions had nearly been made in rooms she was not invited into. The cabin had always represented quiet summers and steady water. Now it represented something else entirely. And as she drove away, she knew that a simple visit to the lake would not just be about inspecting shingles or checking plumbing. It would be the first step in determining how far she was willing to go to protect what had been written in her name. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a thin layer of morning fog hovering over the highway as Caroline drove north toward Lake Everett. The trip took just under 90 minutes, long enough for the landscape to shift from suburban strip malls to open farmland and dense clusters of pine trees. She kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, the envelope containing a copy of the will resting in her passenger seat as if it were a quiet passenger. The closer she came to the lake, the more familiar the road felt, each curve bringing back memories of summers measured not by calendars, but by the sound of cicadas and the smell of wood smoke. When she turned onto the gravel driveway leading to the cabin, small stones crunched beneath her tires. The structure stood exactly as she remembered, modest and unpretentious, green siding slightly faded by years of sun, a wooden porch railing that needed a fresh coat of paint, and 2 rocking chairs positioned side by side. The air carried the scent of water and pine needles warmed by the rising sun. Caroline stepped out of the car and paused, listening. The lake stretched out beyond the trees, calm and reflective, the surface broken only by the gentle ripple of a passing breeze. She walked up the 3 porch steps and ran her fingers along the doorframe. The spare key had always been tucked beneath a flat stone near the entrance. She lifted the stone and found the key exactly where it had been for decades. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than she remembered, but not diminished. The living room held a worn plaid sofa, a bookshelf lined with paperbacks, and a stone fireplace that had anchored countless evenings of quiet conversation. Dust lay lightly across the coffee table, but nothing appeared neglected. She moved from room to room, checking windows, turning on faucets, testing light switches. Everything functioned as it should. The refrigerator hummed softly. The water ran clear. The roof showed no visible leaks. It was not a burden waiting to collapse under responsibility. It was simply a house that had been cared for steadily over time. In the second bedroom, she found a small cedar chest at the foot of the bed. She opened it and discovered neatly folded blankets along with a manila folder tucked beneath them. The folder contained receipts for property taxes and maintenance work, all paid in full through automatic withdrawals from her grandfather's account. Attached to the top receipt was a handwritten note in Henry Whitmore's careful script. It read, "For Caroline, so she never has to wonder if it was meant for her." Caroline stood very still, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. The note was dated 2 months before his passing. He had anticipated doubt. He had anticipated resistance. He had taken steps to remove ambiguity. She closed the folder gently and returned to the living room, lowering herself into one of the rocking chairs on the porch. The lake shimmered under the late morning sun, a boat moving slowly across the water about 50 yards from the dock. She measured the distance in her mind, remembering how her grandfather had taught her to estimate space and time without rushing. What unsettled her was not the possibility of repairs or tax bills. It was the realization that someone had already positioned this place as negotiable. She took out her phone and photographed the handwritten note, the tax receipts, and the intact condition of each room. Documentation felt necessary now, not because the cabin was fragile, but because the narrative surrounding it had begun to shift. As she sat there, the breeze lifting strands of her gray hair, she understood that the coming days would require more than quiet reflection. They would require resolve. The cabin stood solid against the shoreline, unbothered by arguments spoken miles away. And for the first time since leaving the lawyer's office, Caroline felt not just clarity but certainty. The question was no longer whether she could manage this property. The question was why anyone had assumed she could not. Caroline remained at the cabin until late afternoon, moving slowly through each room as if committing it to memory with new eyes. Before leaving, she locked the door carefully and placed the key in her purse rather than returning it beneath the stone. The drive back to town felt different from the one that morning. The road curves no longer seemed nostalgic. They felt deliberate, as though she were crossing a threshold between memory and responsibility. When she arrived home, she transferred the photographs from her phone to her laptop and created a digital folder labeled Lake Everett Documentation. She saved images of the handwritten note, the tax receipts, and the current condition of the property. The act of organizing the files calmed her. It gave shape to something that had begun as an uneasy feeling and was now clearly a matter of record. The following Monday, she called Mr. Davenport and requested a meeting. His office agreed to see her that afternoon. She brought the folder with her, printed copies neatly arranged. The lawyer reviewed the photographs in silence, pausing when he reached the handwritten note. He adjusted his glasses and read it twice. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and said that her grandfather had anticipated potential disputes. He explained that the will was valid and that any attempt to sell or transfer the property without Caroline's consent would have required a separate legal instrument, one that did not exist. Caroline listened carefully, then mentioned the withdrawn inquiry at the county clerk's office. Mr. Davenport's expression tightened. He said that while inquiries were not illegal, initiating them prior to probate completion could complicate matters if done in bad faith. He suggested filing an immediate notice of intent to transfer title according to the will, ensuring the county records reflected the rightful heir before any further action could be attempted. Caroline agreed. The paperwork was prepared that same day. As she signed her name, she felt a subtle shift inside her, not triumph but steadiness. That evening, her mother called again. This time, Linda's tone carried less persuasion and more urgency. She mentioned that a local real estate agent had informed her the property might attract competitive offers due to rising lakefront values. She spoke of market timing and opportunity. Caroline allowed her mother to finish before responding. She said that she had visited the cabin and found it well maintained. She added that she had met with the lawyer and that the transfer paperwork was underway. A pause followed, longer than any before. Linda asked whether Caroline truly intended to manage the property alone. Caroline replied that she did not see herself as alone. The answer seemed to unsettle her mother, who reminded her of the responsibilities that came with ownership. Caroline did not argue. She simply said that her grandfather had made his decision thoughtfully and that she intended to respect it. After the call ended, Caroline sat quietly in her living room, the late evening light casting soft shadows across the walls. She reflected on the years she had deferred to her mother's judgment, on the countless small decisions she had allowed others to frame as practical. None of those moments had felt dramatic. They had been subtle, almost invisible. Yet this situation felt different because it was documented in ink, witnessed, and notarized. The next morning, she received confirmation from the county clerk that the notice had been recorded. The title transfer would proceed according to the will. The official language of the email was brief and procedural, but it carried weight. Caroline printed the confirmation and placed it in the same folder as the photographs and receipts. She understood that this was only one step. There might be objections, perhaps even formal challenges. But for the first time since sitting in the lawyer's office, she felt that events were moving according to something solid rather than assumption. The cabin had stood quietly by the lake for decades, weathering storms without commentary. Now its future was no longer a topic of debate whispered in offices. It was documented, filed, and advancing through the proper channels. And as Caroline closed the folder and set it beside her desk, she recognized that the calm she felt was not denial of conflict. It was the steady awareness that she had finally begun to claim what had already been given to her. The confirmation from the county clerk arrived by certified mail 3 days later, the envelope thick and official in Caroline's hands. She placed it on her dining table and opened it with a letter opener her grandfather had once given her, a simple brass piece that had belonged to him for decades. The document inside stated clearly that the title transfer process was proceeding in accordance with the will and that any formal objection would need to be filed within a specific legal time frame. The language was neutral, procedural, almost detached. Yet as Caroline read each line, she understood that neutrality did not mean the absence of tension. That afternoon, her mother arrived unannounced at the condominium. Linda rarely drove without calling first, which made the sound of the doorbell sharper than usual. Caroline opened the door to find her standing upright, purse clasped tightly at her side, expression composed but resolute. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and took a seat at the dining table where the certified letter still lay. Linda's eyes moved to the envelope immediately. She asked whether Caroline truly intended to escalate matters into a formal legal process. Caroline answered that she had not escalated anything. She had followed the instructions outlined in the will. Her voice remained calm, steady enough that even she was surprised by it. Linda spoke of family unity and unnecessary conflict, suggesting that disagreements handled privately were more dignified. She said that once lawyers and judges became involved, relationships rarely returned to what they had been. Caroline listened, folding her hands in front of her. She did not mention the withdrawn property inquiry again. She did not accuse. Instead, she said that honoring a written decision was not an act of rebellion but of respect. Linda's gaze hardened slightly. She explained that as the only child of Henry Whitmore, she believed she had moral authority over his estate, regardless of the document's wording. The phrase moral authority lingered in the air between them. Caroline felt the weight of years embedded in that belief, years in which decisions had flowed in one direction. She stood and walked to the kitchen, pouring 2 glasses of water. When she returned, she placed one in front of her mother. The gesture was small but deliberate. She said quietly that the matter was no longer a conversation about preference. It was about legality. The probate process was moving forward. If her mother wished to contest the will, she would need to do so formally. Linda did not respond immediately. She looked around the condominium as if assessing it anew, perhaps measuring whether her daughter could manage lake property from such a modest space. After a moment, she asked whether Caroline was prepared for the possibility of public proceedings. The implication was clear. Courtrooms were not private living rooms. They required testimony, documentation, and scrutiny. Caroline answered that she was prepared to present what was written and what had been witnessed. She added that the handwritten note found at the cabin would be included in her documentation. At that, Linda's composure faltered for the first time. She asked what note. Caroline described it calmly, repeating the exact words written in her grandfather's careful script. The silence that followed was not loud, but it was unmistakable. Outside, a lawn-mower hummed somewhere in the complex courtyard, its steady rhythm contrasting with the stillness inside. Linda rose slowly from her chair. She said that this was not how she had envisioned matters unfolding. Caroline replied that she had not envisioned any of it either. Her mother paused at the door, hand resting briefly on the knob, and said that challenging the will might be the only way to ensure fairness. Caroline did not attempt to stop her. She watched as Linda stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind her. When the lock clicked softly into place, Caroline returned to the dining table and sat down again. She read the certified notice one more time, tracing the deadlines and procedures. She understood now that the next stage would likely move beyond quiet conversations. It would involve filings, hearings, perhaps even a judge. The thought did not frighten her as much as it once might have. Instead, it felt like a continuation of the steady path she had begun the moment she decided not to yield. The cabin remained by the lake, unchanged by the discussions unfolding miles away. And as Caroline folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope, she recognized that the real question ahead was not whether the property would stand through legal review. It was whether long-held assumptions about who deserved what could withstand the clarity of a courtroom record. The formal notice of contest arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by courier in a plain manila envelope that looked almost ordinary in Caroline's hands. She stood at her kitchen counter and read the heading twice to steady herself. Linda Whitmore had filed a petition challenging the validity of the will, alleging undue influence and questioning Henry Whitmore's capacity at the time of the final revision. The language was precise and unemotional, but the implication was unmistakable. The matter would proceed to probate court. Caroline folded the document carefully and placed it beside the growing stack of records she had organized over the past month. She did not call her mother. Instead, she contacted Mr. Davenport and scheduled an immediate meeting. His office had already received a copy of the petition. When she arrived that afternoon, the waiting room felt quieter than usual, the ticking of a wall clock echoing softly against framed certificates. Mr. Davenport reviewed the petition line by line, explaining that such challenges were not uncommon when property was involved. He said that capacity claims required evidence, medical records, testimony from witnesses present at the signing. Caroline listened, absorbing each detail without interruption. She provided the handwritten note found at the cabin, the photographs, and copies of the tax receipts. Mr. Davenport nodded slowly as he examined the materials. He explained that the will had been executed properly, witnessed by 2 individuals, and notarized. The burden of proof would rest with the petitioner. Caroline felt the weight of the phrase settle over her. Burden of proof. It meant that assumptions would not be enough. In the days that followed, preparation became part of her routine. She gathered medical records showing that her grandfather had attended regular checkups and had been deemed mentally sound during the months leading to the revision. She contacted the 2 witnesses listed on the will, both longtime acquaintances of Henry Whitmore, and confirmed that they were willing to testify if necessary. Each conversation was respectful and measured. No one expressed surprise at the contents of the will. Several mentioned that Henry had spoken often about the cabin belonging to Caroline one day. As the court date approached, Linda remained distant. Communication between them reduced to brief logistical exchanges regarding unrelated matters. Caroline sensed that their relationship had shifted into something formal and restrained, like colleagues on opposing sides of a quiet negotiation. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse in town appeared smaller than Caroline remembered. The red brick exterior stood solid beneath a pale blue sky, American flag moving gently in the breeze. She parked along the curb and walked up the wide stone steps, the sound of her low heels echoing faintly. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of paper and polished floors. The courtroom assigned to probate matters was modest, rows of wooden benches facing a raised bench where the judge would sit. Linda was already there, seated beside her attorney. She looked composed, her posture straight, hands folded neatly. Their eyes met briefly, neither hostile nor warm. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The proceedings began with measured introductions and a summary of the petition. Caroline listened as her mother's attorney outlined concerns about capacity and influence, suggesting that Henry Whitmore may have been persuaded to alter his will in his final months. The words sounded structured and careful, but to Caroline they felt distant, like an argument built on abstraction rather than memory. When it was Mr. Davenport's turn to respond, he presented the medical documentation, the notarized will, and the witnesses' affidavits affirming Henry's clarity of mind. He emphasized the consistency of Henry's long-stated intentions regarding the cabin. Caroline sat quietly at the table, hands resting on a neat folder of documents. She did not glance around the room. She did not react visibly when her grandfather's capacity was questioned. Instead, she focused on the steady cadence of the proceedings, the neutral tone of the judge asking clarifying questions. As testimony concluded for the day, and the judge announced that a decision would be issued after review of all evidence, Caroline felt neither triumph nor defeat. She felt the steady awareness that everything had been placed on record. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Linda exited through a separate door, her expression unreadable. Caroline paused at the base of the steps and looked up at the building behind her. Whatever the outcome, the matter had moved beyond private persuasion and into documented deliberation. And as she walked toward her car, she understood that the next words spoken about the cabin would come not from family expectation, but from the bench of a judge. The written decision arrived 11 days after the hearing, delivered by mail in a thick envelope stamped with the seal of the probate court. Caroline carried it inside without opening it immediately. She set it on the dining table and removed her coat, allowing herself a few measured breaths before breaking the seal. The document was several pages long, each paragraph numbered, each conclusion carefully reasoned. The judge summarized the petition, the testimony, the medical records, and the witness statements. The language was formal and deliberate, but as Caroline read, the meaning became unmistakable. The court found no evidence of diminished capacity at the time Henry Whitmore executed the final version of his will. The testimony of the witnesses confirmed that he appeared clear, coherent, and fully aware of the nature of his decisions. The notarization had been valid. The handwritten note discovered at the cabin, while not legally required, supported the consistent intent expressed in the will itself. The petition to invalidate the transfer was denied in full. Caroline read the final line twice to ensure she understood it correctly. The will would stand as written. The property on Lake Everett belonged to her. She lowered the pages slowly and sat in silence. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. A delivery truck passed outside, its brakes releasing with a soft hiss. Nothing in the room appeared changed, yet the atmosphere felt different, lighter in a way that was not dramatic but undeniable. She called Mr. Davenport to confirm her understanding. He congratulated her briefly and explained that while her mother had the right to consider an appeal, The grounds for doing so were limited given the clarity of the ruling. Caroline thanked him and ended the call. An hour later, her phone rang again. This time it was Linda. Her voice sounded composed, but quieter than usual. She said she had received the court's decision. There was a pause, long enough that Caroline could hear the faint ticking of a clock through the receiver. Linda stated that she disagreed with the outcome, but acknowledged that the judge had ruled. She asked whether Caroline intended to proceed with finalizing the transfer and registering the deed solely in her name. Caroline answered that the paperwork would move forward according to the order. She did not add commentary. She did not revisit past arguments. Linda exhaled softly and said that she had believed she was protecting family interests. Caroline responded that she believed she was honoring a written promise. Neither voice rose. The conversation ended without resolution beyond the court's own words. The following week, Caroline returned to the courthouse to complete the final recording of the deed. The clerk stamped the document and entered it into the system, sliding the official copy across the counter. The action took less than 10 minutes. Outside, the sky was bright and clear, early autumn air carrying a crisp edge that hinted at changing seasons. Caroline stood for a moment on the courthouse steps, the recorded deed secured in her folder. She did not feel triumphant. She felt grounded. Later that afternoon, she drove north once more toward Lake Everett. The trees lining the highway had begun to shift from green to shades of amber and red. When she reached the gravel driveway, she parked and stepped out into the quiet. The cabin stood as it always had, unchanged by petitions, affidavits, and judicial language. She unlocked the door and walked inside, sunlight filtering through the windows onto the worn wooden floor. She placed the official deed on the kitchen table beside her grandfather's old brass letter opener, which she had brought with her that day. For a long moment, she simply stood there, listening to the faint sound of wind moving across the lake. The judge had not raised his voice. He had not delivered a dramatic speech. He had read the record and applied the law. That was enough. Caroline stepped onto the porch and looked out over the water stretching nearly half a mile across to the opposite tree line. The surface reflected the sky in soft ripples. She realized that the conflict had never truly been about square footage or taxes. It had been about whether her place in her grandfather's story would be rewritten by someone else's preference. Now it was written in court records, filed and stamped. She sat in one of the rocking chairs and let it move gently beneath her, the steady rhythm matching the quiet certainty she felt. The cabin remained where it had always been, but for the first time, there was no question about whose name belonged to it. Autumn settled fully over Lake Everett in the weeks that followed, and Caroline began spending every Saturday at the cabin, not as a visitor, but as its caretaker and owner. She brought practical things first, a toolbox from her storage unit, fresh light bulbs, a gallon of exterior paint that matched the faded green siding. She measured the porch railing with a tape measure, replacing 2 boards that had softened with age, sanding them smooth before applying a steady coat of paint. The work was not rushed. It moved at the pace of someone who intended to remain. Each small repair felt less like maintenance and more like conversation with the past. She kept her grandfather's old measuring tape in her pocket, extending it along the dock to confirm its width, 8 feet across at its broadest point, sturdy enough for 2 chairs and a small table. Some afternoons she sat there with a thermos of coffee, watching the water stretch nearly half a mile toward the far shoreline. The lake did not ask who had won in court. It reflected the sky without judgment. Back in town, her relationship with her mother shifted into something quieter and more deliberate. They spoke occasionally, mostly about routine matters. The earlier urgency had faded, replaced by a cautious civility. Caroline noticed that Linda no longer referred to the property as a burden. She simply avoided the subject altogether. Caroline did not press. She understood that resolution in a courtroom did not automatically translate to reconciliation at a kitchen table. Yet, she also recognized that boundaries once established did not need constant reinforcement. One evening, as the first frost traced thin patterns across the grass near the cabin, Caroline found herself rereading the handwritten note her grandfather had left behind. The ink had not faded. The paper felt firm between her fingers. For Caroline, the note had become less about evidence and more about affirmation. It reminded her that her grandfather had seen her clearly, beyond assumptions about what she needed or did not need. She began making small plans for the following summer, inviting a former colleague from the library to spend a weekend by the lake, considering the possibility of hosting a quiet family picnic if circumstances allowed. These thoughts did not carry triumph. They carried intention. On a mild Sunday afternoon in early November, Linda surprised her by asking to visit the cabin. The request came without argument, without commentary. Caroline agreed. They drove north together in near silence, the highway lined with trees now mostly bare. When they arrived, Linda stepped onto the porch and paused, looking out at the water as if seeing it from a different angle. She walked slowly through each room, her hand brushing lightly against the back of the plaid sofa. She did not mention market value. She did not discuss taxes. After several minutes, she said quietly that her father had built the dock himself when Caroline was a child. Caroline nodded. The statement felt like an acknowledgement rather than a strategy. They sat side by side on the porch chairs as the afternoon light softened. No apologies were offered. No accusations were repeated. The silence between them was not entirely comfortable, but it was honest. As the sun began to lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the water, Caroline realized that ownership had changed more than a line in the county records. It had altered the way she stood in her own life. The cabin had become more than inherited property. It was proof that decisions written clearly and defended steadily could withstand doubt. When they locked the door and walked back to the car, the air carried the sharp scent of approaching winter. Caroline glanced once more at the lake, its surface reflecting the fading sky in muted silver tones. She understood that storms would still come, that seasons would continue to turn, but the foundation beneath the cabin would remain. And as she drove away with the key resting in her coat pocket, she felt the quiet certainty of someone who had finally stepped into a place that had been meant for her all along.